Hi, everybody. So I'm Peter Shearstone. I'm head of quality and regulatory for Thermo Fisher Scientific. We're based in Waltham, Massachusetts, and we're a proud sponsor of the Darwin Festival these last few years. This is an amazing talk by Dr. Skomal, and we look forward to it. Our job at Thermo Fisher is to enable our customers to help make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer. And we know that we're well known in the science community. So, our job is to help, enable our customers to do good things, research, and especially with today's talk, how do we help Dr. Skomal and the conservation efforts on behalf of white sharks. So, Nicole, thanks for the invitation, Ryan. Nicole, over to you for introducing Dr. Skomal.
Perfect. So I'm Nicole. I'm the president of Scuba Club here on campus, and I am super excited to introduce Dr. Gregory Skomal. He's an accomplished marine biologist, photographer, and author. He has been a senior fisheries biologist with the Massachusetts Marine Fisheries since 1987, and currently heads up the Massachusetts Shark Research Program, where he has been actively involved in research on the life history, ecology, and physiology of sharks. He has written dozens of scientific research papers, and his work has been highlighted in several film and television documentaries, including programs for the National Geographic, Discovery Channel, and PBS. He holds a master's degree from the University of Rhode Island and a PhD from Boston University, and we are very excited to have you talk about sharks today.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Let me share my screen. There we go. I appreciate you inviting me, and thank you for the nice introduction. And thank you, Ryan and Peter. It's great to be back at the Darwin Festival. It's been a long time, over I guess we think it's somewhere around a dozen or so years. So it's good to be back. Today, I'm going to talk about great white sharks and what's been changing around Massachusetts and all of New England, actually. What's driving that? And I'm going to focus on specific questions that we're asking and show you some data and how we're answering them. And I want you to get a sense of not only how little we knew about this species up until recently, but also how the tools we're using have changed dramatically over the course of my career, which now spans over 40 years studying sharks. I like to put it in perspective first by giving you a sense of what we do know historically about this species. And what I want you to get from these first few slides is the fact that for many researchers here in the Western North Atlantic, it's been virtually impossible for us to understand and study this species because we were not able to predictably find it. So much of what we know about the species has come from dead specimens that were brought into us by fishermen over the course of the last several decades. Based on those captures, we know in general the distribution of this shark from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, and I'll show you a figure about that shortly. We do know from some physiological studies done on the white shark as well as its closest relatives, the short-fin mako, the porbeagle shark, many decades ago, that it is an endothermic species, meaning it can elevate its body temperature above ambient seawater. And that's actually really unique in the fish world. Based on tissues from some of the sharks that were captured over the course of history, we know a little bit about its natural history, including some age and growth work that I did, and I'll show you that shortly with my colleague Lisa Natanson years ago. We know a little bit about its reproductive biology by looking at the reproductive organs of males, and we know a little bit about its feeding ecology through stomach contents analysis. When we think about what the population is doing historically and over time, we published a paper with my colleague Toby Curtis back in 2014, trying to get a sense of whether the population is shrinking or growing, and it looks like it's increasing after a couple of decades of overexploitation, which occurred in the 1980s and 90s. But unfortunately, up until recently, we knew virtually nothing about its movement ecology. When I talk about movement ecology, I talk about, how this animal lives in the three-dimensional space of the open ocean, over multiple scales, ranging from fine scale behavior all the way up to broad scale migration. So today I'm going to focus on movement ecology and specifically some questions we're trying to answer. I talked a little bit already about what we know about the distribution of the great white shark. And based on fisheries dependent data, that is landings from fishermen dating back as early as the early 1800s, we know that the species is distributed roughly from the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern part of it, along the eastern seaboard of the US, all the way up to Newfoundland. So a lot of the media is talking specifically about climate change and the increase in white sharks occurring off New England. I don't think climate change is playing a role in that. Historically, we know the species has occurred up here. Instead, we're seeing a little bit a shift in distribution associated with a changing prey base. And I'll talk quite a bit about that. What I want you to do is just kind of file this image in the back of your mind. There's over 600 data points here. But if you think about it, those are all the records we have for this species historically, which is not very many, if we compare it to other species. And so really, this has limited our ability to really understand the animal. Nonetheless, as I alluded to earlier, some of these specimens come into the dock, and we've had, as the scientific community, the chance to examine them. This is, for example, a really small white shark that was landed by a fisherman caught in a gill net back in the 1980s. And this, of course, is a very large white shark, again, brought in by a commercial fisherman. Oh, actually, this particular specimen was harpooned by recreational fishermen back in 1983. This is about a 3,000-pound, 17-foot male. And so what we can do as scientists is we can actually dissect these animals, sample tissues, and get a sense of its basic biology. And much of my early career working on sharks, and this dates back to the mid-1980s, involved doing necropsies, looking at tissues to understand their biology. And so even if I have the opportunity nowadays, I still will do necropsies. So I'm going to show you a necropsy in less than 40 seconds. And of course, this is time lapse. But this is a team of scientists working on a great white shark that had stranded on a beach in Cape Cod, back in 2016. And as you can see, we're removing various organs, sampling those organs, really taking the fish apart methodically, although it doesn't look like it with the film sped up, to look at its reproductive organs, to take sections of its backbone, to sample various tissues from its brain and neurological system right to its reproductive system. So this is how we can study various aspects of its natural history. It's a pretty standard technique in fisheries science. And a good example of that would be this age and growth curve that Lisa and I produced in 2015. And it shows the growth curve of white sharks as determined by banding patterns, rings laid down in the vertebrae of these animals. So what you see in the upper left-hand corner here is a section of backbone, and you can look closely and see bands in that section. If you count the bands, you can come up with an age estimate. If you do it over the size distribution of the species, you can come up with a growth curve, and that's typically how we go about aging sharks. And here you can see in this figure that we have ages up to in excess of 70 years. So it's a very slow growing, long-lived species. But as many tissues as we look at to study natural history, we really don't learn anything about its movement ecology, its behavior, how these animals interact and live from day to day, year to year, month to month, whatever the time frame might be over any scale. And so that's been lacking. Although we've had a handful of specimens to sample for this kind of research, we've had very little in terms to learn about the various aspects of movement ecology. However, the very first person to ever get a glimpse into how this species behaves day to day was a man by the name of Frank Carey. And you see him here pictured in the upper left with his brother in the background. Frank got wind back in 1979 that there was a group of white sharks feeding on a dead whale carcass. As elusive as the species is, and as difficult as it is to find, whenever a dead whale would turn up, that was your best opportunity to see great white sharks over much of the last 50 years. So Frank was a scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution that built acoustic transmitters in his lab. And now, of course, we can buy those transmitters off the shelf at any major company that builds them. But here, in those days, 1979, nobody built them except guys like Frank. And he put one of these tags on a great white shark that was feeding on a whale carcass. There's an actual photo after Frank tagged that fish. And what that tag did was allowed him to use that boat that you see him standing on and follow that shark over the course of 3 days. And this was our first glimpse, not only in the Western North Atlantic, but in the world of the behavior of a great white shark. And these are two figures that came from this paper, okay, which he published a few years later in 1982. And he shows in the upper right-hand corner here the horizontal movements of that animal, which basically moved from the eastern side of Long Island out to Hudson Canyon to the west. But what's really interesting is if you look at the lower figure, it's actually the vertical behavior, the diving behavior of this shark. And you could see that it spent the bulk of its time within the thermocline, because you could see the stratified temperature layers there. But you can see also that the shark occasionally dove down to the bottom. Now, this was actually a landmark paper, not only because he was the first person to do this for white sharks, but he's using a relatively new technology to give you really high resolution data on the behavior of any marine species. And in this case, of course, the white shark, which draws the attention of a lot of people around the world. So this paper is published in 1982, and we don't learn much else about white sharks for quite literally decades, because this was it. This was our access to the animals was remained very, very difficult over the course of the next 2 decades. However, what Frank talks about in this paper, which I thought very interesting, is he does reflect a little bit on what this shark was doing. And he argues that the shark remained offshore. It wasn't approaching the shoreline because it's likely an oceanic predator that is relying heavily on scavenging whale carcasses. And he said that because in the Western North Atlantic, Northeastern United States and Canada, seal populations had been driven to the brink of extinction. And we know from other parts of the world, if you have lots of seals, lots of pinnipeds, which includes sea lions, of course, you're going to draw the attention of white sharks if they overlap in terms of their range. And we had removed those, for the most part, from the Western North Atlantic through overharvest over the course of the entire 20th century. But let's fast forward a few years, right? So I just mentioned these global hotspots, and the most traditional ones are in California, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Mexico, and I've starred them here. You'll notice that I've also starred Cape Cod because you could get a sense of where we're going with this. These global hotspots or aggregation areas are where white sharks aggregate certain times of the year to feed on primarily pinnipeds. And so most of the films that you see on television regarding white sharks are filmed in one of these areas. Most of the diving that you want to do with white sharks typically occurs in one of these areas. And most of the science we have about the biology, ecology, natural history of this species comes from research conducted in these areas, because you can predictably find those sharks in those areas. And remember, at the time when Frank Carey was doing his work, seals had been removed from the Western North Atlantic. But along in 1972 came the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And with the Marine Mammal Protection Act came, we had afforded all marine mammals, not just whales and dolphins and porpoises, but seals, sea lions, the highest level of protection. And although it's taken 5 decades, seal populations have become reestablished and have recolonized parts of the northeastern United States and Canada, to the extent that we are seeing larger numbers of seals. My first glimpse, or my first hint that white sharks were starting to come back and revisit coastal New England in larger numbers was in 2004, when a white shark, about a 14-foot female, swam into a small salt pond in the Elizabeth Islands, which occurred off the coast of Cape Cod and run roughly southwest from Woods Hole. Okay, it's a string of islands. This shark swam into this salt pond. I got a phone call. It's a long story. I'm not going to dwell on it today, but suffice it to say, I was able to put a very sophisticated satellite tag on this shark, and we were able to get it out of that pond. Here's a little video of that shark and get a sense of not only the size of the shark, but also how shallow this shark was. And believe me, it was an exciting adventure, strenuous and stressful, because the shark remained in that pond for 2 weeks. And if you look closely at the base of the dorsal fin, just after the fin, you'll see the satellite tag I put on that shark. And so I started paying more attention to white sharks in 2004. And that's because I was continuing to get lots of reports from stranding networks and fishermen to some extent that seals were beginning to also turn up on the beaches with big wounds that looked like this. Okay, now there's not many animals that can do this to a seal. As a matter of fact, in New England, there's really only one, and that is the great white shark. And here you can see a perfect cutout here that created by a white shark in those days. And so we were beginning to see more and more seals, and more seals turn up with these kinds of wounds. And this is through the early 2000s. So what Frank talked about was this lack of seals. And now fast forward 5 decades later, and we've got seals to the extent that you're seeing on the left side of your screen right here, those kinds of densities. And I like to use the analogy of basically of a restaurant opening up. And if you draw, you're going to draw the customers to a restaurant if you put this much biomass on the beach. And those customers, of course, are great white sharks. So here you can see a white shark in the shallows off the eastern shoreline of Cape Cod in hot pursuit of a gray seal. And this is now unfolding off the coast of Cape Cod every day. And but as you can imagine, over the course of the last 100 years, as we remove seals over that same time period, Cape Cod has also changed in terms of its economy. And we've moved away from Cape Cod being a farming, largely an agricultural community, to one driven largely by local tourism. And Cape Cod now is a very, very popular place for people to visit. And one of the greatest attractions for humans, for people visiting Cape Cod, of course, is the ocean and the beautiful beaches that we have. So as you can imagine, having a top predator like a white shark feeding on its natural prey, seals, in close proximity to humans creates the potential for negative interactions between sharks and people. And so the next major section of my talk is going to focus on this issue and how we've changed our research to really focus on producing information that's going to increase and augment public safety. And indeed, off the coast of Cape Cod, we've had some of those negative interactions. If you look in the lower left corner of this screen, you'll see a swimmer in the Buzzards, New Bedford area, specifically in Mattapoisett, not too far actually from where I live. He was bitten and killed in 1936 by a white shark. Since then, we had not had much until 2012, when a swimmer was bitten off of Truro here in the northeastern part of the screen here to the right. We then had some kayakers kayak bitten off Plymouth in 2014. We had a paddleboarder's paddleboard bitten in 2017. And then I specifically highlight 2 events in 2018 one involving a swimmer off Truro, another a bodyboarder, a boogie boarder off of Newcomb Hollow Beach in Wellfleet. And unfortunately, that last attack was fatal. And so we've had this recent increase in negative interactions and shark attacks over the course of the last decade. And as you can imagine, if you are a tourist-based economy, this can create financial hardships. And certainly, you know, the idea of a shark attack in an area as rare as they are will definitely get into the human psyche and change people's patterns of visiting certain places. And so, as you can imagine, you know, Cape Cod is extremely nervous about the presence of these animals. So our research really over the last 5 years is trying to focus on understanding this predator-prey relationship between sharks and seals, you know, and with the purpose being, if we can understand when, where, and how white sharks feed on seals, you know, hopefully we can advise people where and when they should not be in certain areas. All right. So this is the major question. And we, in order to answer it, we are trying to observe behavior, you know, direct observations as well as indirect observations to try to find patterns related to environmental correlates. So a good example of this would be do not swim at dawn or dusk, right? Which we typically say to people, by the way, and I will tell you, in most places, there's no science to back that up, right? Do not swim at high tide, only swim at these areas. Those kinds of things are what we're looking for. Is it related to water temperature? You know, so we're looking for those environmental correlations in these patterns. And we're hoping that patterns will lead ultimately to forecasting, much like, you know, weather forecasters do, right? We're trying to be able to advise people where white sharks are most likely to be feeding on seals. Because when white sharks feed on seals, that's what they want to do. When they bite people, they're making a mistake. They're interpreting a person as representing a potential prey item, and that is a mistake. If it wasn't a mistake, we'd have lots and lots of shark attacks. The ultimate goal being to enhance public safety, you know, to give advice to beach managers, the general public, lifeguards, etc., public safety officials. So how do we do this? How do we answer this question? And I want you all to think about it. I'm going to show you the techniques we're using, but we're trying to observe an animal over a fairly broad area throughout the entire day, and night. And so that can be very, very difficult. So we're using a variety of techniques. And here's where we get into some of the newer technologies that have evolved over the years. You know, Frank Terry used an acoustic transmitter. So he was using acoustic telemetry back in 1979 that he was building in his lab. The technology exists still, you know, but it's evolved. It's gotten better. You know, the transmitter he built lasted on the order of days. The acoustic transmitters that we're putting on sharks now and other marine animals will span up to a decade in terms of their battery life. So now we can get long-term movements over much greater scales of time and space, you know? And we've set up an array of acoustic receivers, and I'll talk about this in a second, throughout Cape Cod and Massachusetts waters to get a sense of, to try to answer the when and the wheres. Okay, what areas are most vulnerable and when are they most vulnerable to white sharks, you know, biting and feeding on their prey? We use satellite-based tags as well to not only look at some fine-scale three-dimensional movements, but also broad-scale movements. Where do white sharks go when they leave Cape Cod? You know, do they continue on to the Gulf of Maine? Do they go south? Do they go offshore? That's how we answer those questions. And that's sort of like bigger picture questions. To really drill down into what these animals are doing, you know, not every day, but every hour, every minute, every second, we're using acceleration data logging behavior tags. And we typically refer to these as animal-borne imaging tags. And these are camera systems built into tags. And I'll show you how those work momentarily. And of course, we're using drone technology because it's a bit of a no-brainer. You know, those tools are fantastic, a great way to observe animals without influencing their behavior. And you can do it from, of course, above them And so we're using drones throughout the summer season to get a sense of how these animals are behaving close to shore. Our tagging technique is relatively unique in that we're not chumming the water for sharks. Instead, we will not draw the sharks to us, but go to the sharks. And so you see in this photo to the left is my spotter pilot, Wayne Davis. Wayne is a great photographer too. You could see the photo he took of me tagging a white shark. Wayne looks for sharks in the shallows of Cape Cod. Once he finds one, he will direct us over to where that shark is. And I'll be out on the end of a platform or a pulpit on a small boat. So we have the capacity to move quickly to any area along the outer Cape any given day. So I'm going to show you a video of the tagging technique. And it's really well orchestrated between the spotter pilot, the captain of the boat, who is up in the tower on the boat, who's looking out for white sharks. Once he sees it, once I see it, we can then steer over to it. And here's a shark just minding its own business, swimming near the surface. And you're going to see me approach from our tagging vessel, the Aleutian Dream. I'm going to go out to the pulpit, and I've got a very long tagging pole, about 12 feet long. It's got a very thin, narrow needle on the end of it. At the end of that needle is a small barb or dart that's tethered to an acoustic tag. All right. So that's just like Frank's tag, emits a very high frequency sound. But instead of baiting this shark or capturing it or hauling it out of the water or grabbing it in any way, I'm just going to place that dart right at the base of the dorsal fin, which is where most people have been tagging sharks over the course of history, the last 100 years. And you're going to see the shark react right there. But what it's going to do is it's going to settle out, come back to the surface, and behave normally. And what we're trying to do, of course, is be as least invasive as possible. You know, if you're studying behavior, you don't want to modify it. And that's kind of a really big rule when it comes to science, right? You don't want to modify the behavior of the animal that you're studying. And so that's why we use this particular technique without stressing the animal or handling the animal in any way. So the tag technologies, which I'll talk about for the balance of this talk, involve acoustic tags, of which we've tagged over 300 individual white sharks, the pop-up satellite tag, which will stay on the shark for up to a year. And while it's on the shark, it will archive every 10 seconds, depth, temperature, and light level information. Those data will then be transmitted to a satellite after it detaches from the shark up to a year later and floats to the surface and begins to transmit. So you can recreate the three-dimensional movements of that shark up to a year later. So it's a retrospective analysis. And like I said, those are really good for broad scale movements. And of course, we've put out almost 30 behavior tags, okay? So camera tagging systems, which I will talk about. A lot of people always ask me, where are you tagging these sharks? Because you know what? I go to the beach at Duxbury. I go to the beach up in Gloucester. I go to the beach in Buzzards Bay. All of our work is off of the Outer Cape, okay? So these are the locations where we have seen white sharks from Provincetown down to the southern tip of Monomoy along the eastern shoreline of Cape Cod, okay? You'll also see a couple of areas that we've tagged sharks inside Cape Cod Bay. But it's really important for me to emphasize that the figure on the right is really what we call effort-dependent information, okay? It's information that really depends more on where I'm going as opposed to a more unbiased sampling method. So just because you do not see any sharks in the middle of Cape Cod Bay doesn't mean they are not there. It just means I didn't sample in that area for any amount of time. What we're going to see through the acoustic data is effort-independent information coming from these tags that will tell us where the sharks truly do spend their time. This is the way the acoustic transmitter works. Now remember, Frank Carey put it on a shark feeding on a whale, and then he followed it with the boat, okay? And that allowed him to simulate the track of the shark while collecting depth information from the transmitter itself. What we're doing nowadays, though, is putting the tag on the shark And instead of following it, we're putting out an array of acoustic receivers throughout Massachusetts and beyond. The acoustic receiver, which you see pictured here on the left, will detect the shark when it swims within a range of anywhere between 50 and as much as 500 meters, depending on where you are in Massachusetts and depending on the conditions in the ocean in Massachusetts. So where that at that particular location. Once it detects the shark, it will record the date, the time, and who that shark is. Okay, so the individual ID of that animal. And so when we pull those receivers at the end of the year, we can then pull those data, look at the number of detections, see who was there, and you can imagine the kinds of questions we can answer. We could look at a particular swimming beach and determine whether white sharks visit there. And we can do that over the entire range of the state of Massachusetts. So let's start mining some of our acoustic data and start to answer some really simple questions like when and where are white sharks in Massachusetts? And this is what our array looks like. Okay, this is each one of these yellow dots is an acoustic receiver that we've set up. You can see our little simulated white sharks emitting their high frequency sounds that are picked up by the receivers. And then, of course, we can go ahead and pull those receivers at the end of the year and determine, again, a retrospective analysis of who was where and when were they. So let's go ahead and answer some of those questions. When are white sharks off Cape Cod? This is a really simple question to answer. I take all my acoustic data and I just plot it out as a frequency analysis by month, right? And so if we do that, we can see that white sharks are not in Massachusetts year-round. Actually, you can't see them on this figure because the number of detections we have from our receivers is over, 900,000. But there actually are a handful of detections in April and May. Very, very few sharks, but a handful of detections as they begin to arrive. Really doesn't start to ramp up until July, and then peak months, as you can imagine, August, September, October. The presence of these sharks is driven by optimal water temperatures, and those are temperatures, above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, up to about 68, 69 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the range they really want to be in. Once it starts to get much cooler than 50, as begins to happen in mid to late November, the sharks will move out. Although they will stay as long as mid-December, just a handful, most of them are gone by the end of November. And you can see that really clearly in this bell-shaped curve, with August being, of course, the peak month. So if you love to surf and swim in August, which most people do, of course, you're going to be overlapping with white sharks. But does that mean you're going to be overlapping with white sharks everywhere? So where are we detecting these animals? Where do they spend their time in Massachusetts? So this is a very simple bubble figure, showing each one of our receivers. The size of the receiver is proportional to the number of sharks detected. So as we get into those deeper orangey red colors, you'll see that it's more white sharks. As we get bigger in size, it's more white sharks. And as we anticipate, because of the presence of seals along the outer Cape, that is indeed where the bulk of our sharks are spending their time. Yes, the eastern side of Cape Cod Bay will also draw those animals. But as you move west and north, you are not seeing large numbers of detections whatsoever. Buzzards Bay, Nantucket Sound, south of the Vineyard, south of Cape Cod, very few, if no, white sharks are being detected there whatsoever. So really the zone where these animals are spending time is along the outer Cape, along that eastward facing beaches. And of course, if we were to plot out where we see seals, that's where the seals are. So the sharks are going to where they can feed on seals. So what I'm going to do in this next graphic is, it's a bit of an animation, is I'm going to combine the spatial data with the temporal data, and you're going to actually look at the movements of white sharks into Massachusetts waters. And I've highlighted some of the receivers here during the summer of 2019. So in the upper left of this figure, you could see the date. which starts in June. And as I start and march through this animation, you're going to see that the sharks will begin to arrive as we get into June and into July. And most of those receivers are going to light up along the outer Cape, all right? And they're going to stay persistently lit up along the outer Cape, particularly as we get into the months of August, September, October. You can see the size of the bubbles swell as well. Occasionally along the South Shore, south of Boston, you'll see those receivers light up as sharks move through. Those animals are more transient. What they're doing is they're moving up into the Gulf of Maine to feed on large numbers of seals that occur up there, as well as Nova Scotia, all the way up to Newfoundland. So they're going to keep migrating north. Some of these animals might stay along the outer Cape for the season, but most of them move out and move north. And then, as you can see, by late November, December, they've all left. So those are actual detections over the season of 2019. For me, the more difficult question, we can easily mine the acoustic database to answer the whens, the wheres. So I've already learned now, if I want to surf in January, it's perfect because there's no white sharks there, right? I've also learned that if I'm managing a beach in Duxbury or perhaps in Gloucester or even in Salem, right, we're not seeing large numbers of white sharks whatsoever. But if I'm managing a beach anywhere along the outer Cape from Provincetown to Chatham, there's a healthy presence of white sharks overlapping with human activities, and I need to be cognizant of that. But how do they go about hunting seals? What's their predatory strategy? And here's where we get into some difficulties, because although we go on the water many times during the year, we're primarily out during the day. But we do and we are able to observe predatory behavior of white sharks, okay? Occasionally we will see a white shark attack and kill a seal. Now with an estimate of over 800 white sharks visiting Cape Cod, right, and through one of our other studies, and the presence of tens of thousands of seals, you would think that I would see white sharks eating seals every day and that you guys can drive out to Cape Cod and go observe that. That is not the case. It's remarkable. We haven't seen this happen very well. So either we're not in the right place at the right time, or they're not very good at it. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. So we've had to expand our research into using other techniques that involved indirect observations. But we have seen some cool things, and I'm going to show you a couple videos. One is of a white shark attempting to attack and kill a seal from start to finish, and one of the very rare breaches we've ever seen. And so you're going to watch this video, and it's going to happen very quickly, but don't worry, I'm going to slow it down. This is a seal that encounters a white shark. The white shark sees the seal and decides to go for it. The seal has no place to go but straight up in the air, and the white shark follows it. There's the seal and there's the shark. So this is one of the rare breaches, and we'll zoom in on that, and we'll show that again. So the seal goes straight up in the air to avoid the shark, and the shark follows it in an attempt to kill it. And the seal wins. So for those of you voting for the seal, you guys won this time. But the seal doesn't always win. And we've been able to actually observe a handful of these kinds of observations where a white shark has bitten a seal. The seal typically dies very quickly because it bleeds to death very quickly. In this particular case, the white shark bit the seal in half. And what you're going to see is when this happens, we will go to that location, right? We will collect information on the depth, the temperature, the location, obviously the time of day. We'll then look up information relative to tide. So we'll collect all that biotic and abiotic information that will help us discover patterns in behavior. And so what this white shark's now trying to do is tear off the rich, thick blubber layer that this particular seal has on it, all right? White sharks really are targeting seals for the blubber. They're loaded with energy, and they can store that energy in their livers. And so it's been hypothesized that a white shark, if it eats a seal, fills its belly with a seal, it doesn't have to feed for about 2 weeks. That doesn't mean it's going to stop feeding, but it does mean that it does provide them with a lot of energy. So from an energetic point of view, it's worth it for a white shark to come into the shallows of Cape Cod and attempt to hunt seals. What's another method we can use? Okay, so we're out there all the time. We've only seen them kill seals a handful of times. We don't have a big enough sample size to draw any conclusions. So we're going to go into a couple of indirect methods to study white shark behavior. And this particular one, we're conducting with the Center for Coastal Studies out in Provincetown, and specifically UMass Boston student Brian Laguerre. And so what he's doing is he is taking acoustic receivers, the very same receivers we've been using, and we put them so close together that we can triangulate the exact positions of sharks in our nearshore areas. So what you see in this figure is head of the Meadow Beach in Truro. You can see the beach on the lower part of the figure. You can then see, as we move offshore, the various depth stratification based on color. So the yellow is deep water, the purplish water is shallower. And if you look very closely at this, you'll see there's a yellow band right in the middle. That's a deep trough between two sandbars. And for those of us who go to Cape Cod and swim, we're used to seeing a double sandbar system. So what Brian's interested in is, what are the movements of white sharks relative to this habitat? So if I'm lifeguarding this beach, where is this shark likely to be hunting? So the little triangles you see are all acoustic receivers that he's put very, very closely together. So we can actually triangulate the movements of individual sharks as they go through that area. Now, we can't do this in real time, but we pull those receivers and we can then calculate the exact positions of of the shark as it's moving through that area. And one of the things it's going to jump right out at you. These little black dots are all the receivers, but the trail that you're looking at is clearly in the deep trough between the two sandbars. So this is the kind of information we will give lifeguards. I'll say to them, know your beaches, know exactly what your beach looks like at high tide and low tide, know your water depths, because in all likelihood, because white sharks are ambush predators, right? They need to be in water that will conceal them. That's hard to find around Cape Cod because of the shoaling and the sandbars, and of course the change in tides. And so these animals are going to hide in those deep troughs, and seals that are then leaving the beach to go out feed will be ambushed, because they rely heavily on speed and stealth to successfully attack and feed on their prey. Another technique we're using are these new behavior tags. And I want to end with this before I go to the broad scale movements, which will take only a minute. These systems are really quite sophisticated. They didn't exist 10 years ago. They're absolutely fascinating. It's basically a camera system built into a tag. And what you see on this shark is an acoustic tag at the base of its dorsal fin, which we want to stay on for 10 years. It's got a tether to a camera tag system that has sensors in it, as well as a video camera. That tether is designed to fail, so it's going to corrode and detach after 2 days. Over the course of those 2 days, the sensors in that tag are going to record the depth, the temperature, whether that shark is turning right, left, going up, down, whether it's accelerating or slowing down in 3 dimensions. And it's going to do that 20 times per second. And that will allow us to recreate the behavior of that animal over the time period that that tag is on the shark. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Here's a white shark that is hunting seals. Now, these are not stupid seals. They are staying in very shallow water. In order to not be bitten by a white shark, that's where they need to stay until nightfall, when they typically move offshore to feed. This white shark is prowling just outside in deep enough water where it's safe. However, what happens with this, it's also carrying one of our camera systems. What this white shark does is it loses its patience and decides to rush into the shallows. You could see the surf breaking on the right side of your screen into one of these seals, all right? So I'm going to show you what this looks like, not only from the perspective of the camera system, but from the perspective of the data collected by the tag itself. So let's ride the back of this white shark. And you'll see it's cruising along at a fairly slow speed until it gets close enough where it wants to strike. And when that happens, the camera is going to go kind of crazy. You'll see a little bit of the bottom, you'll see a little bit of surf, you'll see the bright surface as this shark begins to accelerate to speeds very well in excess of 15 to 20 miles an hour, okay? So now it's in hot pursuit of the seal. For those of you who want the shark to get the seal, I'm sorry, but it doesn't. This is a clear case of the shark failing on this predatory strike. And it turns out that they can fail, about half the time or more. So you can imagine it's a huge expenditure of energy. It sprints and then it needs to go rest. And so what this shark does is after it attempts to get this seal is it slows down and slowly moves out to deep water where it rests before coming back in after a half hour or so and trying again, and goes through this repeat cycle in an attempt to kill seal. Remember, there's a big energetic payoff, so it's worth spending a little energy to do it. So we went through this video painstakingly, frame by frame, and if you look closely, I circled the image of the seal as it actually got away from the shark. But what does this look like from a data perspective? Remember, we're collecting what this shark is doing in three-dimensional space. So this is a really good example over the course of several minutes. The shark, the tag is on the boat, so it's at 0 depth. We put the tag on the shark dives down. When we put the tag on the shark, you remember the video I showed you, it takes off, okay? It's going to be spooked by the tag, it's going to feel the tag, and it's going to take off. So what you see in these lower 3 figures, right, is the shark accelerating in 3 planes, right? Up and down, back and forth, and forward. So if you look further into the track, you see 2 more attempts where the shark moves into shallow water and accelerates, okay? These are signatures of attempted predations. So if I have a data set that spans 2 days, I can look at the attempted predations. I can look to see whether the shark succeeded by comparing it to the video. We, in essence, can take this data set and recreate the movements of that shark in time and space during this failed predatory strike. So in essence, we're able to observe the behavior of the animal in 3-dimensional space, right, without having to be there, which opens up the entire nighttime and the dawn and dusk periods when we're not out on the water. And of course, all those days we're not out on the water, because every time we get on the water, as you can imagine, there's an expense associated with it. I'm going to finish with 3 quick slides on where they go when they leave, because a lot of people wonder where these sharks come from, where do they go to, what's their broader migratory patterns. And I'm going to start with 1979, what we knew then relative to Frank Carey's acoustic track, okay? This is all we knew for many, many years. And then Jack Casey and his team, Toby Curtis, put together a summary of all my little green dots historically of where white sharks occur, which really shows that they're a coastal species. But it also tells me that this is likely a biased data set because it reflects also where people are fishing. Remember, these are fisheries interactions. So now let's look at the data from our satellite-based technology. And you'll see that the movements of this animal are far broader than we ever anticipated. We went up from 600 data points to well over 1 million data points that show us where these animals are in time and space. And what we found really intriguing is if we look at this aspect of their life, when they move into the offshore environment, we see that they're now moving to depths in excess of 1,000 meters, going through a really, really broad temperature range. And so their movements are broader. They have this oceanic phase. We had no idea they did that based on fisheries-dependent data, historical data. So the new tagging technologies are not only giving us information about what these animals are doing over really fine behavioral scales, but also of what they're doing over broader migrational scales. So stay tuned because this research is ongoing, and I'll absolutely come back and do another Darwin Festival in the future to update you. If you're interested in what we're doing, you want to see more, Atlantic White Shark Conservancy has a website with the logbook data, which shows our acoustic detections, our catalog with over 600 individuals. And of course, there's the Sharktivity app if you want to tune into the movements of these animals. And with that, and I hope I haven't gone too long, I will entertain some questions and thank you guys and encourage you, if you're interested in sharks, to feel free to run out and grab a couple books that I've written. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Greg. We have quite a few questions here, so we'll see how many we can get to.
Okay.
The first question that I have for you, you showed the time-lapse video of the necropsy of the white shark, and there's a question about genetic analysis. Do any of your colleagues using some of those tissues to do genetic analysis? And are they finding differences between sharks in white sharks in New England and white sharks living other places in the world?
Yeah, we're definitely sampling for genetic work. And I've been collaborating with Gavin Naylor at the University of Florida in Gainesville, where he has definitely found population structure on a global scale and even some population structure within the Northwest Atlantic. That's pretty intriguing. So absolutely. What we try to do with these necropsies is maximize as much as we can get from the dead animal.
Great talk, Greg. And I just checked, you were here last in 2015, so not quite as long ago as we thought.
Wow. Thanks, Ryan.
I have a question here, which I think must be from one of our students. What did you study during your undergrad years, and how did you go about getting into field research after that?
Yeah, so I went to the University of Rhode Island many decades ago, and I went there with the intent of being a marine biologist. And at the time, URI did not have a marine biology degree, so my degree is actually in zoology. But URI offered a lot of some field courses, but I began volunteering at the National Marine Fisheries Service lab in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and specifically the program that studied sharks. And they allowed me to go in the field with them, and then they hired me as a technician. So I am a classically trained field biologist. I absolutely appreciate the question, and I think if you can get in the field, even if it's not studying exactly what you want to study, do it anyway. My advisor as an undergrad studied sticklebacks and eels. My interest was in sharks, but I helped him. And I learned a lot about field work. So, you don't always have to focus on what you love. Load your belt with all kinds of tools.
Great. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks. The next question, what should you do if you come in contact with a shark? Would it be a good idea to escape, or try to escape, or would it be a good idea to fight?
Well, not many of us will have weapons on us that will allow us to fight. So the best thing to do is if you see a shark and you're nervous about it. I mean, there are many of us who go diving with sharks intentionally, and we're disappointed if we don't. But if you do see one, you're a swimmer in an area, you don't anticipate seeing a shark. There's one, you want to leave the water quickly without panicking, without splashing, without drawing attention to yourself. All right. And keep your eyes on it at all times. Make sure you're facing it and just get out of the water. Do not panic. That's the key.
Greg, another question related to the longevity of sharks. Does the fact that they live so long make it difficult to collect behavior data?
No, not necessarily. The fact that they live in the ocean makes behavioral studies very difficult for any marine animal, really, unless it lives on a coral reef. You can park your butt there with a scuba tank. It's great. But if you have a highly migratory animal like sharks, tunas, a lot of marine mammals, they're difficult to study behavior, and that's why we use multiple methods. The longevity in most shark species actually renders them very vulnerable to overexploitation because they're slow growing, late ages at maturity, low reproductive rates, and just like marine mammals, they can be overexploited and overfished very, very, very quickly.
Great, thanks.
Do you think that by tagging mostly on the Outer Cape, you're tagging sharks that mostly hang out there, and that there might be other sharks that hang out in different areas but aren't tagged?
I love the question because it's true. We did a mark recapture population study, published it last summer. Megan Winton, one of my students, did a phenomenal job. And she did find out that the sharks we tag on Cape Cod tend to hang out on Cape Cod, right? That's why we're also working with Canadians and tagging sharks in off Nova Scotia and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we're also tagging sharks off the southeastern US off South Carolina. So really important to make sure you are tagging all elements of the population, because individuals do have different behavioral traits that sometimes they might not, some animals might completely avoid Cape Cod.
Here's an interesting question for you, Greg. You mentioned that a shark who has a good meal won't need to feed for 2 weeks. The question is, why would it still try to feed, as you suggested?
Well, I mean, hypothetically, we don't have to eat it 3 times a day either, right? But we do. So, it's a good question. Plus it's a bioenergetics exercise, right? So, hypothetically, if you did a bioenergetics exercise on us, we probably don't have to eat. We probably have to eat once every 5 days, right? But the truth is we eat more frequently, and the same is true for fish in general. They're opportunistic and they never know when their next meal is going to come. So as long as they can digest that meal and dump that energy into storage, which sharks do very, very effectively with a very large liver, then that makes perfect sense to keep doing it.
If I can just butt in quickly, Thea, I think we can probably have time for 2 more questions.
Do the behavior tags affect a shark's successful predation rate, since they're moving around near the fin and may be visible to prey?
Good question. Because of the strategy of the white shark is speed and stealth, it's not going to be the tag that gives away the shark. It's probably going to be the size of the shark itself. The seals that are the ones that have been around more than a year are very, very aware and vigilant of sharks, and they're forever looking in the water for sharks, and particularly if they move from off the beach into deeper water. So by all accounts, it doesn't appear our tags influence the behavior of the sharks or the seals whatsoever. But I like the way you're thinking, because that's the one thing you don't want to do. By tagging animals, and when we do it on land and we do it at sea all the time, you want to make sure that you're not, inserting yourself into the equation to screw things up.
The final question for you, Greg. Do you think that the increase of orca attacks on white sharks in California could lead to those whites moving this way across to the East Coast?
No, there's no connectivity between the oceans, except in the Indian Ocean, where white sharks tagged off South Africa have gone as far as Australia and back again. So that was a single individual. So we have not had any movement. I mean, as you can imagine, white sharks are heavily studied in California, Mexico, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. And we have not seen movements, interoceanic movements like that between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But we have seen impacts on white shark populations by orcas, specifically off South Africa, where they basically scared all the sharks away from many, many areas. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. It's great to be back at the Darwin.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Nicole. Take
Bye.
care, Thea. Bye, Derek.